It was a perfect day, or so it seemed. The kind of day that promised nothing but sunshine and good times. But for Henry Dalton, the billionaire heir, it was the calm before the storm. His heart was racing, not because of some business deal or his usual high-profile meetings, but because today he was about to do something that could change everything, something that would put his love for Rebecca Miller to the ultimate test. See, Henry had been in love with Rebecca for a while. She was everything he wanted, beautiful, kind, and smart, and it seemed like everything was falling into place. A proposal on the horizon, a perfect life waiting to unfold. But as is often the case, when you're dealing with wealth and power, things weren't as simple as they appeared on the surface. Rebecca's family, the Millers, were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly the warm, welcoming type you'd expect from a family ready to accept their daughter's future husband. Henry had always felt a little out of place around them. Rebecca's father, a successful and often ruthless businessman, seemed more interested in expanding his empire than in the happiness of his own daughter. Her brother, Jake, wasn't much better, arrogant, dismissive, and always with that smug look on his face. But it wasn't just their attitudes that set off alarm bells in Henry's mind. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the polished smiles and lavish dinners. There was a feeling that Rebecca's family wasn't just after his money. They were after something much more sinister. Now, Henry was faced with a decision. He couldn't just stand back and let things unfold without knowing the truth. If Rebecca's family was hiding something, he had to find out what it was, no matter what it took. So, he came up with a plan, a daring one, the kind of plan that could either make him look like a genius or ruin everything he had worked for. Henry decided to do the unthinkable. He would pretend to be someone else, a gardener, a lowly employee who worked around the estate, doing menial tasks, cleaning the grounds. It was risky, yes. He had to hide his true identity from Rebecca, the woman he was about to marry. But if there was one thing Henry had learned from his years of navigating the cutthroat world of business, it was that the truth didn't always reveal itself in the boardroom. Sometimes it took a disguise, a little deception, to see things clearly. And this wasn't just about his life anymore. This was about Rebecca's future, too. He had to protect her. As the days went by, Henry settled into his role as John, the gardener. At first it felt strange, almost unreal. He was used to people bowing down to him, admiring his wealth, his success. But here, dressed in plain clothes and picking up leaves, no one knew who he was, and no one treated him with the respect he was used to. Rebecca's family, her father, her brother, and even her mother, had no idea who he really was. They treated him like just another worker. It was almost like they didn't even see him as human. The way they barked orders at him, the way they spoke down to him, it made Henry sick, but he couldn't let his true identity slip. He had to stay in character. Every conversation, every action had to be carefully planned. If they knew who he was, the game would be over, and he'd lose any chance of uncovering the truth. But the more time Henry spent in the Miller household, the more unsettling things became. The family, in all their wealth and grandeur, had dark secrets. He watched them closely. The way they interacted with each other, the coldness in their eyes when they spoke about Rebecca's future. It wasn't just concern for her well-being. It was something else, something that smelled like greed, something that made Henry's blood run cold. One evening, as Henry was trimming the hedges in the garden, he overheard a conversation between Rebecca's father and her brother. They were talking in low, hushed tones, but Henry could catch bits and pieces of their words. "She doesn't know, does she?" her father asked. "No," Jake replied. and she never will if we do this right." Henry's heart raced. What were they talking about? What was this secret that Rebecca had no idea about? His curiosity piqued. He started to dig deeper, looking for any clue, any hint that could explain their cold behavior. But the more he searched, the more dangerous things got. Henry's fear grew when he discovered financial records hidden away in the family's private study. The numbers didn't add up. There were large, unexplained transactions, and it seemed like the Millers were covering up something huge. But what was it? And why didn't Rebecca know about it? His mind raced with possibilities. Could they be using her to secure their wealth? Was her marriage to him part of some grand scheme that he was unknowingly stepping into? And then there was Rebecca herself, beautiful, loving, and so completely unaware of the dark truths surrounding her family. Henry couldn't help but feel torn. She deserved to know the truth, but how could he tell her without destroying everything they had? How could he explain that the family she loved might not have her best interest at heart? As the days passed, the tension continued to build. Every smile from Rebecca felt like a lie. Every kiss, a bittersweet reminder of how complicated their love had become. She still had no idea that the man she was about to marry was the same person she had been treating like a servant. And what if the Millers found out who he really was? What if they figured out his game? Would they destroy him? Would they destroy Rebecca? The time was drawing near. Henry had to decide whether to reveal the truth, expose Rebecca's family for the lies they had been hiding, or stay silent and watch as they manipulated her into a future she didn't deserve. But as Henry prepared to confront the Millers, something unexpected happened. Rebecca's brother Jake cornered him in the garden, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You've been asking too many questions, John," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Maybe it's time you stop digging into things you don't understand." Henry froze. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Would Jake expose him? Would the truth come crashing down around him? Or was this just the beginning of a much bigger, more dangerous game? The tension was unbearable. And just as Henry was about to respond, Rebecca appeared at the edge of the garden, her eyes filled with confusion. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the thick air. In that moment, everything hung in the balance. The truth was so close, yet so far away. Would Henry be able to protect Rebecca from the family that had been hiding so much from her? Would he ever get the chance to tell her the truth? Or would he lose her before he could? Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where the secrets of the Miller family come to light, and Henry must decide how far he's willing to go to save the woman he loves. Rebecca's voice broke through the tension like a sharp, cold breeze. Henry's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, frantically trying to think of an excuse, a way out of this impossible situation. "What's going on here?" she asked again, her eyes flicking between him and her brother, Jake. Henry's thoughts scattered, but he quickly composed himself, trying to mask his nerves with a calm expression. Jake was still standing there, his eyes narrowed in suspicion, his posture rigid. Henry knew he couldn't afford to slip up. One wrong move, and everything would unravel. He couldn't risk Rebecca finding out who he really was. Especially not like this. "Nothing's going on," Henry finally said, his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Just doing my job, Ms. Miller." Rebecca glanced at her brother, who wasn't backing down. She frowned, clearly sensing something was off. "Jake, what's the matter?" she asked, her tone more insistent. Jake let out a small forced laugh, trying to dismiss the moment. "Oh, nothing. Just thought I saw something strange, that's all. But it's fine." He looked at Henry, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. "Right, John," Henry nodded. keeping his face neutral. "Just doing my work, that's all." He didn't want to give anything away, but deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time Jake would try to dig deeper. Rebecca didn't look convinced, but she seemed to let it go. "All right," she said with a soft smile. "Well, dinner is in an hour. You should get cleaned up." As she walked away, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't let Rebecca know the truth, not like this, but the deeper he dug into her family's secrets, the more dangerous things became. He had already uncovered too much to turn back now. The Miller's mansion was everything you would expect from a wealthy family. Grand, elegant, and pristine. It was the kind of place that oozed power and money. But there was something unsettling about it. Henry had always felt like an outsider. Even when he was still Henry Dalton, the billionaire heir. But now, hidden in plain sight as John, the gardener, it was as though he was invisible to them, a ghost. The feeling of being overlooked, dismissed, was strange. But it also gave him the freedom to observe, without drawing attention. In the quiet moments when he was alone in the gardens, or working in the corners of the estate, he started to piece together what he had learned. Rebecca's family didn't just have money, they had influence. They had connections that reached into the highest circles of business and politics, and they were willing to do anything to keep it all intact. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about power, control, and the lengths they would go to maintain it. Henry had seen it before in the business world. The ruthless ambition, the willingness to sacrifice anything or anyone for the sake of success. But this felt personal. The way they treated Rebecca, the way they seemed so disconnected from her true happiness, sent chills down his spine. It was like they were preparing her for something she didn't know about, and he had to figure out what it was before it was too late. That evening, as Henry made his way into the lavish dining room, the tension was palpable. The Millers were all seated at the table, already eating, as if Henry were just another invisible servant. He took his place at the back of the room, out of sight, but close enough to overhear everything. The conversation drifted between topics, but it always came back to one thing: business. The conversation was all about securing new deals, making moves, and planning for the future. There was no mention of family, no talk about Rebecca's upcoming wedding. To them, it was just another step in the grand scheme. Henry clenched his jaw, his unease growing. Then came the moment that made his stomach drop. Rebecca's father, Charles Miller, leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in hand. "The wedding is still on track, right, Jake?" he asked, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of something darker. Jake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Dad. Everything is moving along perfectly. We'll have the perfect union, just like we planned." Henry's heart sank. Just like we planned. Those words echoed in his mind. It was clear now that this wasn't just a simple wedding. This wasn't just about Rebecca's happiness. It was part of a bigger plan, a plan that Henry wasn't supposed to be a part of. After dinner, Henry slipped away from the table, excusing himself with a mumbled apology. He couldn't sit there any longer, pretending like everything was fine. His mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. What were they planning for Rebecca? Was it just about the marriage, or was there something more sinister at play? He walked through the garden, trying to gather his thoughts. The moonlight illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. As he passed a row of tall hedges, a voice called out from the shadows, startling him. "You're not what you seem, are you?" Henry froze. He knew that voice. It was Jake's. The sound of his footsteps grew louder as he emerged from the darkness. His face twisted into a knowing smirk. "What are you talking about?" Henry tried to sound calm, but inside, panic was bubbling up. How much had Jake figured out? Jake's eyes gleamed with a hint of amusement. "Oh, come on. You think I didn't notice? I know exactly who you are, Henry Dalton." Henry's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected Jake to catch on so quickly. He had to think fast. "Find a way out." "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with uncertainty. Jake took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're not fooling me. I've been watching you, and I know you're not some gardener named John. So why don't you drop the act and tell me what you're really after?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Henry's mind raced. How had Jake figured it out? Had he been too careless? Or was there something more to Jake's cold, calculating behavior than he realized? "Look," Jake continued, his tone shifting, growing darker. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you won't get away with it. If you think you can come into my family's house and start digging around like some hero, you're wrong." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. The stakes were higher now than ever. Jake knew, but what did he intend to do with this knowledge? What did he want from Henry? Before Henry could respond, Jake smirked again and turned to walk away. "You've been warned. Stay out of things you don't understand." Henry stood there, frozen, his thoughts a chaotic mess. This was just the beginning. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The secrets the Millers were hiding, what were they willing to do to keep them buried? And now that Jake knew his true identity, what would happen next? As the night stretched on, Henry realized that there was no turning back now. The truth was too close. But the more he discovered, the more he feared for Rebecca. Would she be able to survive the storm that was coming? Or would she be caught in the middle of a web of lies and manipulation? And more importantly, would he be able to protect her before it was too late? Henry stood there in the garden, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. Jake's words echoed in his head, making the air feel colder than it should have been. Stay out of things you don't understand. But the more he thought about it, the less he understood. The more he uncovered, the less clear the situation became. What was Jake's game? Did he really suspect him? Or was this some kind of intimidation tactic? Henry couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. Not when Rebecca's future was hanging in the balance. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. As he turned back toward the house, the weight of the entire situation pressed down on him. The Millers weren't just another rich family with petty drama. They were a well-oiled machine, and Henry had just stumbled into the gears. And yet, he couldn't turn away. He couldn't back out now, not when he was this close to the truth. If there was even the slightest chance that Rebecca was being manipulated, he had to do something. The night was still young when he found himself standing in the hallway, just outside Rebecca's bedroom. He had been here 100 times before, watching her prepare for the day, or seeing her get ready for an evening out with her family. But tonight, something felt different. Something felt off. The family's normal routine, quiet dinners, business, talks, had taken on an air of unease, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. But no one would dare acknowledge it. Rebecca had always been so open with him. But lately, he'd noticed a shift in her. There was an underlying tension in her words. When they talked about the future, something he couldn't quite pinpoint, she'd become distracted, less certain. He had assumed it was just pre-wedding nerves. But now, with everything he'd uncovered, he wasn't so sure. He walked to the study, where he knew the family kept their private documents. He had already made a mental note of the security system, having figured out how to bypass the cameras and access the information without leaving a trace. The financial records he'd stumbled across earlier had been unsettling to say the least. But tonight, he was going further. He needed more proof. As he entered the study, the room felt cold. Not just the air, but the atmosphere itself. Like a place where secrets were locked away. The walls were lined with bookshelves and expensive trinkets. But Henry wasn't interested in the decor tonight. He was after something far more dangerous. Something that could change everything. He pulled out the drawer he'd accessed before. The one filled with financial ledgers and contracts. His fingers ran over the pages, skimming the numbers. Most of it was standard business stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. But then his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. A series of transactions involving a company that wasn't listed in the public records. The amounts were staggering, and the name on the documents was one Henry recognized all too well. A rival corporation he'd been trying to buy out for months. He froze, the realization hitting him hard. The Millers weren't just wealthy. They were in bed with some of these most dangerous people in business. This wasn't just about power or money. It was about control. The kind of control that could ruin entire industries, destroy careers, and leave people broken. And Rebecca, his fiancée, was caught in the middle of it all. Henry took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. And it wasn't just about protecting Rebecca anymore. It was about keeping her safe from the storm that was brewing around them. Her family wasn't just cold or indifferent. They were actively involved in shady dealings. And Henry wasn't sure what lengths they would go to in order to protect their empire. As he was about to gather the documents and leave, a creaking sound made him stop. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Rebecca. She was dressed in her nightgown, her face pale in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, filled with confusion, and something else, suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her voice shaking just enough to make him question how much she already knew. Henry's mind raced, his thoughts scrambling to come up with a believable answer. But in that moment, he knew it was pointless to lie. There was no way to escape the truth now, not when Rebecca was standing right there. His heart clenched in his chest. He couldn't keep this from her any longer. But how could he tell her? How could he explain that her family, the people she loved, were hiding something so dark and dangerous? I need to talk to you," Henry said, his voice strained. He dropped the papers back into the drawer, his hands shaking slightly. "I found something you need to see." Rebecca didn't move. She just stared at him, as though trying to process what was happening. "What is it, Henry? What's going on? Why do you look so different?" He stepped forward, slowly, trying to find the right words. "Rebecca, I don't know how to say this, but your family, they're involved in something you don't understand. Something dangerous." Her expression softened, and for a moment, it seemed like she might believe him. But then the skepticism returned. "Dangerous? Henry, what are you talking about? My family is not involved in anything illegal." Henry felt the heat rise in his chest, the frustration building. "You don't understand. I've seen the records. Your father, your brother, they've been making deals with people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. This isn't just about business. It's about power. And they've been using you all along." Rebecca shook her head, taking a step back. "No, that's not true. You're just confused. You're looking for something that isn't there." He could hear the disbelief in her voice, and it hurt more than he expected. He reached out, grabbing her wrist gently. "Rebecca, please. You have to trust me. I'm doing this because I love you. I'm doing this to protect you." Her eyes filled with doubt. "Protect me from what?" "My family. Henry let out a shaky breath. I wish I could explain everything, but I need you to listen to me. You're not seeing what's really going on. They're playing a game you don't even know about, and you're the one who's going to lose in the end. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Rebecca pulled her wrist away, shaking her head again. I don't know what you're talking about. You're acting crazy, Henry. You're my fiancé, and I thought you were here to build a life with me, not tear my family apart. The words stung more than he expected. Rebecca's trust in him was slipping away, and the truth was now hanging in the balance. The walls were closing in on him. Henry's mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything, that would make her see what he was trying to protect her from. But before he could say another word, he heard footsteps behind him. The door to the study creaked open, and in walked Jake, his presence a looming shadow. Is everything all right in here? He asked, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge of menace. Henry's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The trap had been set, and he had just walked right into it. Rebecca looked between the two men, confusion and worry evident in her eyes. Henry knew, in that moment, that whatever happened next would change everything. Henry's mind raced as Jake stepped into the study, his presence like a cold draft that cut through the room. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The air felt thicker, the silence more suffocating. Rebecca's gaze flickered between her brother and Henry, her confusion growing with every passing second. Henry could feel the walls closing in around him. The moment he had feared, the moment where everything would finally come to a head, had arrived. Is everything all right in here? Jake's voice was calm, too calm, as if he knew exactly what was going on, and was toying with Henry. There was a dangerous edge in his words, an unspoken threat that made Henry's stomach churn. Rebecca, still caught between disbelief and growing concern, turned to her brother. Jake, what's happening? Why does Henry look like he's hiding something from me? Jake's eyes flicked to Henry, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of recognition, something almost like amusement in his gaze, before he turned back to his sister. Nothing's happening, Becca, he said smoothly. You're just being paranoid. Maybe it's time you let your fiancé get some rest. He took a step forward, his tone turning cold. And you, Henry, you've been poking around where you don't belong. I think it's time for you to leave. Henry's pulse raced. He knew what Jake was implying. The tension was unbearable. It was clear now. Jake had caught on to his investigation. Henry had underestimated him. He had thought he was being careful, but Jake was always one step ahead. Now, he wasn't just a threat to his relationship with Rebecca. He was a direct threat to Henry's safety, to everything he was trying to protect. Henry took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't back down. He couldn't leave Rebecca in the dark. Not now. Not when he had come this far. Jake, he said, his voice strained but firm. I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere until Rebecca knows the truth. Rebecca's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it again, unsure. Henry could see the confusion in her eyes, the conflict. She wanted to trust him, but the weight of her family's influence, their power, was pulling her in the other direction. She was caught between the love she had for her family and the love she had for him, and it was tearing her apart. Jake took a step closer, his smile growing thin and menacing. You really think you can just waltz in here and expose my family? You think Rebecca is going to believe you over her own blood? His voice dropped to a low, threatening whisper. You're out of your league, Henry. You don't know what you're up against. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. Everything he had uncovered, everything he had learned about the Millers, was crashing down on him. He was standing at the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send everything spiraling. But he couldn't back down. Not now. "Rebecca," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I know this is hard to believe, but your family is hiding something big. They're involved in shady deals, in business that could ruin everything. You don't know them like I do." Rebecca stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Henry, stop, please." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "This isn't you. You're acting crazy." Jake smirked, his gaze never leaving Henry. He knew exactly what to say to push all the right buttons. "You see, Becca, he's just trying to manipulate you. He's trying to turn you against your family. This isn't love. It's control. He's using you, just like he's used everyone else." Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for her brother, her face pale. "Jake, I don't know what's going on here, but Henry, he's not like that. He's not trying to control me. He's—" Before she could finish, Jake cut her off. "Don't listen to him, Becca." His voice was hard now, almost cold. "I'm telling you, this is all part of his plan. He's trying to tear us apart. If you really love your family, if you really want to protect what we've built, you need to stay away from him." Henry felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over him. This wasn't just about his relationship with Rebecca anymore. This was about everything. Her future, the lies her family had been hiding, the darkness that had crept into their lives. If he didn't stop it now, it would consume them both. "I'm not trying to tear you apart," Henry said, his voice hoarse. "I'm trying to save you. Can't you see that? Your family is lying to you, Rebecca. They're using you, and you don't even know it. I need you to trust me. Please." Rebecca was silent, her face pale, her hands still trembling. She was caught in the middle, torn between her brother, the man who had always been her protector, and Henry, the man she loved. And in that moment, Henry knew that nothing he could say would change her mind. Not yet. She wasn't ready to face the truth. Not when it meant shattering everything she thought she knew about the people she loved most. Jake looked between them, a flicker of victory flashing in his eyes. "You're wasting your time, Henry. She's not going to believe you. And neither am I. If you don't leave right now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." For a split second, Henry thought about walking away. He thought about leaving, cutting his losses, and trying to figure out another way to protect Rebecca. But he couldn't. Not with her in danger. Not when everything was this close to unraveling. The air between them was thick with tension, every word feeling like a blow, every moment stretching longer than the last. It was clear that Jake wasn't going to back down. He was playing a dangerous game, and Henry was caught in the middle of it, with Rebecca still uncertain of which side to choose. Henry took a step forward, his voice low and urgent. "Jake, I'm not leaving. And if you think for 1 second that I'm just going to walk away from Rebecca without doing everything I can to protect her, you're wrong." The room seemed to freeze, the silence deafening. Rebecca looked from her brother to Henry, her eyes wide with fear. This was the moment of truth, the tipping point. Jake didn't move. His lips curled into a thin, almost mocking smile. "You've made a mistake, Henry, a big one." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And in that moment, Henry knew that this wasn't just about uncovering the Millers' secrets anymore. It was about surviving the consequences of revealing those secrets. As Jake stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Henry's, Rebecca took a hesitant step backward, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. The storm was about to break, and no one, least of all Henry, knew what would come of it. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door to the study swung open, and another figure stepped into the room. Someone neither Henry nor Jake had expected. Rebecca's father, Gregory Miller, walked in with his usual air of authority. He wasn't just another figure in the room. He was the patriarch, the man whose presence alone commanded respect and fear. Gregory's sharp eyes scanned the scene before him. His gaze flicked from Jake to Henry and then to Rebecca, lingering on her for just a moment longer. The weight of his stare was enough to send a chill down Henry's spine. The room felt even colder now, and for the first time, Henry realized just how deep this situation went. It wasn't just Jake who posed a threat. It was the entire Miller family, and Gregory was at the top of that chain. Is there a problem here? Gregory's voice was calm, but his words cut through the silence like a blade. His tone had a way of making anyone in the room feel small, irrelevant. Rebecca looked at her father, then at Henry, confusion still written all over her face. She didn't know who to trust anymore, and that uncertainty was like a weight pressing down on her chest. Henry took a deep breath, his heart racing. He had hoped to keep this conversation between him and Rebecca for just a little longer, but now that her father was here, he knew there was no going back. "Mr. Miller," Henry said, trying to steady his voice, "I need to talk to Rebecca about something important, something her family has been keeping from her." Gregory raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I see." He stepped further into the room, positioning himself in front of Rebecca, as if protecting her from the chaos that Henry was about to unleash. "And what exactly is it that you think you're protecting her from, Henry?" Henry could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the point of no return. The family's empire was built on lies, and now that he was standing here, trying to expose the truth, he could feel the walls closing in around him. "It's not about protecting her from something. It's about showing her the truth," Henry said, his voice growing firmer, despite the anxiety that twisted in his gut. "Your family, your business dealings, are dangerous. I've seen the records, Gregory. You're involved in deals that could bring everything crashing down. And if Rebecca doesn't know what's going on, then she's walking blind into a trap." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Gregory's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that put anyone at ease. It was cold, calculating. "I see. So this is how it is now. You come into my house, accuse me of things I've spent my entire life building, and think you can just walk away with Rebecca's trust." He shook his head slowly, the smile never fading. "You're delusional, Henry." Rebecca's eyes flicked from her father to Henry, her confusion mounting. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was scared now, scared of the truth, and scared of the secrets that seemed to be unraveling faster than she could grasp them. "What is he talking about?" Before Gregory could answer, Jake cut in. "It's just another one of Henry's wild stories. He's trying to make you doubt everything you know, Becca. He doesn't belong here." Jake's voice was laced with venom, his hands clenched into fists. "He's dangerous." Rebecca recoiled at Jake's harsh tone, but she didn't know how to process everything. She wanted to believe her family, but part of her was terrified that Henry was telling the truth. She could feel the pull of both sides. Her family, who had always been there for her, and Henry, the man she thought she would spend her life with. But now, everything felt uncertain. Gregory turned his attention back to Henry, his eyes narrowing. "You've been digging into my business, Henry. You should have known better than to think you'd get away with it. People like you don't get to walk into this house and throw around accusations without consequences." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He had no idea where this conversation was going, but he couldn't back down. Now, not when he was so close to the truth. "You're right," he said, his voice steady but low. "There are consequences, but they're not just for me. They're for Rebecca too. She deserves to know what kind of people she's trusting, what kind of life you've built for her." Gregory's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice now icy. "I've spent years building this empire, making sure everything is in place. You think you can come in here and destroy it with a few words?" Henry swallowed, feeling the gravity of the situation. "I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to save her. Save both of us." Gregory's eyes flashed with something darker. "You think you're the only one who knows how to protect her, don't you?" His voice was low, dangerous now, and Henry could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "You think you're the good guy in all of this? You have no idea what I'm willing to do to keep my family safe." Before Henry could respond, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Suddenly, the sound of a phone ringing broke the heavy silence, its shrill tone cutting through the atmosphere like a knife. Gregory, without even a glance, reached into his pocket and answered the call, his voice still carrying that same cold authority. "Yes?" he asked, his eyes flicking to Henry and then back to Rebecca. "I see. Are you sure?" "No, I'll handle it. Thank you." Gregory ended the call with a snap of his fingers and looked at Henry with a new intensity, a hint of something unsettling in his eyes. "That was a very important call," he said, his voice tight. "And now, Henry, I think it's time for you to leave." Henry didn't move. He stood his ground, but his heart was racing. There was something in Gregory's eyes, something more than just the cold, calculated anger. It was a threat, the kind of threat that made it clear that no matter how much he fought, he was playing a game that he couldn't win. Rebecca's eyes flicked between her father and Henry, the weight of her decision finally sinking in. She wanted to understand, wanted to believe Henry, but everything in her life had been turned upside down. The man she loved, the family she had trusted, were now at odds in ways she never could have imagined. The tension in the room was suffocating, the stakes higher than ever. And just as Henry opened his mouth to speak, to try and convince Rebecca one last time, Gregory's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a call. It was a message, one that would change everything. Gregory's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, breaking the suffocating tension that had settled in the room. He glanced down at the screen, his face briefly flickering with something like surprise. Then, a shadow of unease passed over his features. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if preparing himself for something he hadn't expected. Henry watched him, his instincts on edge. There was something off about this entire situation. He could feel it in the air, the way Gregory was standing, his posture tense, despite his usual calm demeanor. The older man wasn't just playing the game anymore. He was reacting to something bigger, something that Henry couldn't quite put his finger on. Without a word, Gregory turned and walked toward the study's large desk, his movements slow but calculated. The atmosphere felt heavier now, as if the entire house was holding its breath. He tapped a few keys on the phone, his brow furrowing, and then muttered something under his breath that Henry didn't catch. He could sense that the tension had just escalated into something entirely new. "Becca," Gregory said, his voice low, almost unrecognizable from its usual authoritative tone. "We need to talk. It's about Henry's accusations." He paused, looking at his daughter with a strange, almost distant look in his eyes. "And about what's been happening behind the scenes." Rebecca, still reeling from the intensity of everything that had unfolded, was now even more confused than before. She glanced from her father to Henry, her mind desperately trying to catch up with the whirlwind of revelations. "What do you mean, Dad?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What's going on? Why is everyone acting like this? You're scaring me." Gregory didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, holding the phone in his hand like it was a lifeline. Finally, he let out a slow sigh and met Henry's eyes. There was something about the look in Gregory's eyes that unsettled Henry, something that felt too much like a silent admission. The walls had come crashing down, and now there was nowhere to hide. "I didn't want you to know this, Rebecca," Gregory began, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "But you deserve the truth." He paused again, collecting his thoughts. "The company, our family's wealth, none of it came from what you think it did." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? Dad, what are you saying?" Gregory looked at her with a long, heavy gaze, his face lined with something akin to regret. "Your mother and I, He hesitated, struggling to find the words, and for a moment, it seemed like he might stop there. But then he sighed deeply and continued. "We've been involved in more than just business dealings. The things we've done, the paths we've taken to build this empire. I never wanted you to know, but it's all tied up in things much darker than what you could ever imagine." Rebecca took a step back, her hand trembling as she clutched at her chest. "No, this can't be true." Her voice cracked. "I've seen you work hard my whole life, Dad. You've always said it was all for us. For me." Gregory's gaze softened, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes. "I wanted it to be that way, but the truth is, Rebecca, I made deals with people who have far more power than I ever realized. People who—" He stopped, his expression hardening again as he looked toward Henry. "People who will do whatever it takes to protect their interests. And now they know you're digging into things that should stay buried." The weight of Gregory's words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. The mystery that had been unraveling, all the pieces he thought he understood, suddenly twisted into something far more sinister. The Millers weren't just involved in shady deals. They were entangled with forces far more dangerous than Henry had ever suspected. Rebecca stood frozen, her mind clearly racing to process the shock of it all. She turned to Henry, her expression raw, desperate for answers. "What's he talking about? Henry, you've been right, haven't you? All along." Before Henry could respond, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Everyone turned in unison, and without waiting for permission, the door creaked open. A figure stepped into the room, and Henry's heart nearly stopped. It was someone he never expected to see. "Gregory," the figure said, his voice low and almost mechanical. "I believe it's time to end this." The man who stepped inside was none other than Thomas Miller, Gregory's older brother. He had been out of the picture for years. His sudden disappearance from the family business, something that Henry had always found curious. And now, here he was, as if everything were coming full circle. Thomas looked every bit the part of the family's dark side, dressed in a tailored suit, his face sharp with age and experience, and his eyes as cold as steel. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Greg," he said, eyeing his brother. "And now it's time to clean up the mess you've made." Henry's mind spun. Thomas's return was the final piece of the puzzle, the twist that no one saw coming. Gregory, it seemed, wasn't in control of everything after all. There was a deeper web of deceit here, one that even he was entangled in. And now, as the walls closed in, it was clear. No one in this family was untouched by the dark dealings that had shaped their empire. Gregory's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "You don't get to come back here and lecture me, Thomas," he growled. "This isn't your fight anymore." But Thomas wasn't backing down. "It's always been my fight, Greg," he said, his voice calm, but tinged with something darker. "And now it's time to face the consequences." Rebecca's gaze darted between her father and uncle, the realization dawning on her. "You, both of you, have been lying to me this whole time. What kind of people are you?" Her voice broke as she stepped backward, her world crashing down around her. Henry reached out, but she pulled away from him, her fear palpable. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Just as the tension reached its peak, another phone rang, this time a loud and insistent sound. It was Gregory's phone again. He looked at it, his eyes narrowing. Without saying a word, he answered the call. "Yes?" He paused, his face draining of color. "What do you mean?" "It's been compromised." The call ended abruptly, and Gregory's expression hardened. He turned to Thomas, his voice barely above a whisper. They know," Thomas repeated, his tone cold. "Everything you've tried to hide is out. There's no going back now." Rebecca looked at Henry, the pieces finally clicking into place. The truth was ugly, far worse than she ever imagined. But as the last of the lies crumbled around her, one final truth emerged from the shadows. The Millers were not only criminals, they were about to be exposed in ways they couldn't control as the door slammed shut behind Thomas and Gregory. Leaving Henry and Rebecca alone in the study, the air was thick with uncertainty. Rebecca's heart was shattered, and Henry had no idea what would come next. But one thing was clear. The danger wasn't over yet, and now, with the truth out in the open, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room after the door slammed shut was deafening. Henry and Rebecca stood there, the weight of the last few moments settling in like a thick fog that neither of them could shake off. Her father and uncle's sudden confrontation, the unexpected truth, and the call that seemed to change everything. It was all too much. Rebecca's mind was spinning, trying to process it all, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. "Rebecca," Henry's voice broke through the tension, though it sounded distant and uncertain. He took a step toward her, but she didn't move. Her eyes were glazed, lost in a sea of confusion and betrayal. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All my life, you've been telling me one thing, and now, I don't even know who you are." Her words stung, sharper than she intended, but the anger and hurt that bubbled inside her couldn't be contained any longer. Henry felt the sting of her words, but he understood. He'd never meant for it to come to this. He never wanted to be the one to drag her into this mess. But somehow it felt like the truth had been building up for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. He stepped closer, wanting to hold her, to comfort her. But he knew that it wasn't his place to offer solace just yet. Not when the damage had already been done. "I'm sorry, Becca," he said, his voice low, full of regret. "I never wanted you to have to go through this, but I couldn't sit back and watch everything unravel without you knowing the truth. You deserve to know, even if it hurts." She turned her back to him, her hands clutching at her arms as she tried to steady herself. "And what now? What do I do with this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I've always trusted my family. How could they do this to me? How could—" "My own father." Henry reached out gently, resting a hand on her shoulder, his touch a quiet reassurance. "I know it's hard. Believe me, I know. But now that it's all out in the open, you can make your own choices. You don't have to live in the shadows anymore. You don't have to hide from the truth." Rebecca closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over, but she held them back. The weight of it all was unbearable. She had spent so long living in the illusion that everything was fine, that her family's wealth and power came from hard, work, and dedication. But now it was clear that everything had been built on lies and secrets. And as much as she wanted to hold on to the image of her father she had always known, deep down, she understood that things would never be the same. "I don't know if I can forgive them," she said softly. "I don't know if I can ever look at them the same way again." Henry nodded, understanding her pain. He had seen it in his own family, how secrets could destroy everything. But the one thing that he had learned through all of this was that the truth, no matter how ugly, was always better than the lies, even if it meant losing everything. "I'm not asking you to forgive them," he said quietly, "but I do think you need to make a choice. Your future doesn't have to be tied to their mistakes. You don't have to carry this burden on your own. And if you want, I'll be here to help you figure it out. Whatever you decide, you're not alone." Rebecca turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. She needed to hear him say it, to know that he truly meant what he said. "You'd help me, even after everything that's happened." Henry nodded without hesitation. "I don't care about the past. I care about you, and I'll help you through whatever comes next." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. She had trusted him once, and despite the chaos of the past few days, she could feel that same trust returning. He hadn't lied to her, not like her father, not like Jake. He had only wanted to protect her, and maybe that was something she could hold on to. After a few moments of silence, Rebecca let out a shaky breath. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, "but I think you're right. I need to make my own decisions. I can't keep living in this world of lies. I need to take control." Henry smiled softly, his heart swelling with relief. "You're stronger than you think." Just then, there was a knock on the door. Rebecca froze, her body tense as she turned toward the sound. She didn't know if she was ready to face anyone else right now, especially not her family. But the door slowly opened. It wasn't Gregory or Jake who stepped in. It was a lawyer. He introduced himself as Richard Miller, a family attorney who had been involved with the Millers' affairs for years. But today, his role was different. He wasn't here to defend the family or protect their interests. Instead, he looked at Rebecca with a sympathetic gaze. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Miller," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But I believe it's time you knew everything. Your family's empire, what you thought was your inheritance, isn't as secure as you've been led to believe." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Richard walked toward her, his eyes grave. "Your father's dealings, they're far more complicated than even he realizes. There's a financial collapse on the horizon, and if you don't act soon, everything they've built will crumble. There's not much time left." The words hit Rebecca like a punch to the gut. The world she had always known, her security, her future, was slipping away. But now instead of feeling hopeless, something shifted inside her. This was her chance. The truth had been exposed, and with it, the power to decide her own path was finally in her hands. "I need to think," Rebecca said, her voice steady now despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I need time to figure this out." Henry stepped closer, his support unwavering. "Take all the time you need, but know this: whatever happens, you're not alone. You've got the power to change everything." The lawyer nodded, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "I'll leave you to it, Miss Miller, but please don't wait too long." As the door closed behind him, Rebecca looked at Henry. There was no more uncertainty, no more hesitation. She had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in days, she felt like she could see a way forward. The past was gone, and whatever the future held, she would face it on her own terms. And with that thought, she took Henry's hand. knowing that the journey they were about to take, together, was only just beginning.